Hello, my name is Andrius, and I want to talk about some horror stories from around the world that I read in May. Before I begin, I should say this is my first time making a proper video like this here on booktube, and I have no idea what I'm doing, so I'm sorry in advance. With that kind of disclaimer out of the way though, last month I read a lot of horror short stories from different countries, and I did this as a sort of reading project for Horror Mayhem, which I probably don't need to explain what Horror Mayhem is. I imagine if you were seeing this video, I assume you probably found it through Horror Mayhem, unless it's, you know, some kind of algorithm magic. But just in case, Horror Mayhem, this is a reading event here on booktube, originally devised by a channel called The Bookish Brians and hosted by a bunch of other excellent channels. Happens every year in May, and is meant to encourage people to read short form horror fiction, so short stories or novels under a certain number of pages, I think. I don't remember what that number was exactly. Now, for a few years now, I've enjoyed watching other people's videos on Horror Mayhem, from people like Criminali or Roy from Roy Reads Anything, and lots of other channels. And I don't know, this year I figured I would try to make one of my own, I guess as a way to kind of try and dip my toe into booktube and see if that's something I want to do. And I figured Horror Mayhem in particular would be a good opportunity to do that because, well, one, I love a reading project. So now that I finally have the time to actually follow along with the reading event, I definitely want to do that. And two, because I love horror stories. Horror and short fiction in particular, I think, are a really good match of kind of form and theme, I guess. And I really like short stories in general, probably more than other kinds of fiction. I feel like if I had to choose, you know, my favorite form of literature and only read that, so, you know, poetry, novels, short stories, plays, well, first of all, that would be a stupid thing to do, but I would probably choose short stories. So yeah, definitely Horror Mayhem seemed like a good fit for me. And this year, I think, the theme for Horror Mayhem was World Tour. I don't remember exactly if it was short stories by writers from different countries around the world, or if it was short stories set in different parts of the world. But either way, in my case, it's both, so it doesn't really matter. So I wanted to talk about two different collections that I read in May, of mostly translated horror stories. And what I did first, the first one I picked was, well, I figured it was a good time to finally read the Valancourt book of World Horror Stories, the first volume, which I've had on my Kindle for years and years now. So this is an anthology focusing on contemporary writers from mostly non-English speaking countries, and specifically they wanted to collect some stories that had not been translated before. Most of these, not all, but most of these stories are actually translated by James Jenkins from Valancourt Books, one of the two people running Valancourt Books, I think, which is very impressive. Overall, the anthology was a really solid collection, I think, and I enjoyed it. The stories there are mostly, well, mostly the standard, sort of horror, with some, with some outliers approaching weird fiction or surrealism, but most of them are kind of standard horror. Not a lot of folk horror, surprisingly. I would have assumed like a world horror collection and folk horror and folklore would be a good match, but maybe that was too obvious. There were some folklore elements, but not as much as I was expecting. I definitely enjoyed the weirder stories more, but there weren't that many of them, so it's like there was kind of like a cap as to how much I could really love the collection personally, because like I like horror a lot, but I don't care about things like monsters, gore, body horror, and so on. That's not really my kind of thing. I want I want vague horror, like a more surreal sort of terror, I guess. I want atmosphere and delicious gothic writing, kind of this vague sense of dread. That's more that's the kind of horror story that I tend to really fall in love with. But still, I still enjoyed it, even though it didn't really have many of those kinds of stories. I still really enjoyed the collection overall. I will go through the stories one by one, I think. I have some notes here on each one. So the anthology opens with a story from Italy, which was Oironda by Luigi Musolino, in which we have a long-haul truck driver who has lost everything that mattered to him, and so he takes a kind of off-ramp off of the highway and out of this reality. It was fine, but it didn't really do much for me. I think I found it pretty tropey. Well, I know I found it pretty tropey in a slightly irritating way. Like, if you know the tropes and the memes about fathers and husbands in horror, then you know exactly what happens in this story. It's telegraphed very early on as well, so I don't think that's a spoiler at all. It was kind of predictable in that sense. I did like the concept of this, highway off-ramp leading into a different sort of reality. The story doesn't really do much with it atmospherically. The writing is too kind of workman-like, I guess, to do anything interesting with. I think Musolino has a pretty heavy hand as a writer as well. Like, it is pretty heavy-handed. I think things that could have been suggested are for the most part stated outright, which is fine. It's still good. It's still good, but not a story that I loved. Next up, there was a story from Spain, Mater Tenebrarum, if I'm saying that correctly, by Pilar Pedraza. I'm going to butcher a lot of these names. Some of them I might not even try and say out loud and just put them on the screen. We'll see. Anyway, this was really good. It's a grave robber girl going on a sort of bizarre, gothic, tragicomic adventure. And this was definitely one of the more interesting stories in the anthology. I don't know how I feel about comic horror, like humorous horror or humorous gothic as a concept, but I enjoyed it in this case. This was very theatrical, very gothic, maybe a little bit too like gross and body horror-y for my tastes, but still I like this a lot. The third story was from Hungary by Attila Veres, and the story was The Time Remaining. which was, I think, a really good evil doll story that did not resonate as much with me personally. Probably because I don't care about evil dolls as a trope, but I don't have any actual criticisms like for the story itself. It's very well written, and the sort of gradual build-up of horror is also done really well. There's a point earlier on in the story where the protagonist, who is a child, hears his doll, who's been like this kind, supportive presence in his life. He hears this doll just swearing at night, cursing, you know, when the doll probably thinks that the boy cannot hear it, and that's just like a really sort of kind of moment. Yeah, it read as more disturbing than something more extreme in terms of its like sort of outright horror would have, I think. There's a real sense of kind of perversion and evil in the way it's written, and you know, especially in the context of the protagonist and the sort of childish innocence and so on. Next up, another story from Spain, from Cristina Fernández Cubas, and the story is The Angle of Horror, which was a big yes for me. So the protagonist's older brother has returned from his studies in England, and he's kind of a changed person. At some point he has become aware of a kind of quote-unquote angle of horror in the world, a way of seeing things that makes them sinister, I guess, or evil or hopeless. And after seeing it once, he can never he can never escape it again. And this is the kind of horror story that I love, the sort of indeterminate, slippery, hard to pin down, kind of abstract horror, something which to me is, you know, something stronger and more frightening than like a straight up monster. Okay, next up we do have a monster horror story from Romania, Down in Their World, by Flavius Ardelean. I should have looked up the pronunciations of these names, but I didn't. I'm unprepared. Well, I'm sorry. But this was probably one of the, like, I'm not going to say worst stories, because none of the stories here are bad, really, but one of the stories I was least interested in this collection. In this story, it's a difficult time in rural Romania. People are starving and poor and, you know, desperate to make money in some way. And there's a group of men who set out to scavenge what they can from an old abandoned mine, which is a mine that's believed to house a kind of evil presence that's part supernatural and part very much human-made. The concept is alright, but I think that there's a nice kind of folklore element, but the way it's presented, I think, is just kind of boring. I mean, at one point, somebody, like one of the characters in the story, literally remarks that, oh, you know, the horror of this place is human as much as it is otherworldly, which, like, yeah, it is. No, I get it. You don't need to have a character literally say that. I guess if you know, don't mind stories that just say everything outright, you'll be fine with it. But for me, this kind of very literal and kind of didactic approach, it does not make for a very good story. Next up, there was a story from Peru by Tania Tuniela. The story is called The Collector, in which a supernatural woman demon creature collects men in a kind of pocket limbo place of her own. they can never again leave, which was fine. Nothing too special. Very much a so what kind of story for me, where I read it, I enjoy it, but then that's it. Next up, another really good one. This one was from Mexico by Bernardo Esquinca, Signor Ligotti. This was one of my favorites in the anthology. The titular Ligotti is this mysterious rich old man who attends a book event and takes an interest in this struggling writer, the main protagonist, and Ligotti offers to help facilitate his work and also rent him a relatively cheap and nice apartment in an area where the writer wants to live, I think, if I'm remembering it correctly. And it seems like an offer that's too good to be true, and it does come with certain conditions. Essentially, Ligotti does all of this in exchange for friendship, I guess, or so it seems. But then what Ligotti means by friendship turns out to be something different. It's a kind of spoiler, but I think it's pretty obvious. There is a home invasion horror aspect to this, which is very effective and anxiety-inducing. Although I think, in general, I'm pretty susceptible to home invasion horror, so it could be just me. And I don't know, the story is just really good fun in general. I didn't really see where it was going in advance, so I was definitely surprised by the second half. Next up, I'm not sure where this is from actually. It might be France. Anyway, this is by probably not Michael, Michel Roche, The Illogical Investigations of Inspector André Desperin. And this follows the titular Desperin working on 3 supernatural cases at different points in his career, from the very beginning to the very end, when the supernatural stuff he's investigating finally consumes him. And yeah, was a fine sort of occult detective sort of story in 3 parts. I did find the 3 parts a bit too short to really be interesting in themselves. It felt a bit fragmented. But yeah, it was good. It was good. Next up, a story from... But the story is, I think, like an Ivory Coast sort of story, and according to the editor's note in the anthology, it's kind of satirizing Ivory Coast society. So I'm going to say it's an Ivory Coast story. Anyway, it's a story in which this is a fantastical version of the Ivory Coast, where women are really only desirable as girlfriends and wives when they're very young, and when they enter menopause, they cease to be seen as women entirely, which sounds, just like a true statement, probably for lots of countries. But in this story, it's quite literal. And yeah, I don't know, it was good. It was good, definitely on the more I wouldn't say light-hearted, but a bit humorous, surreal side of things. Although I'm not sure why the writer decided to have the big thing that happens, the big reveal, why it's treated as a sort of mystery when really you can see it coming a mile away. And the protagonist can as well. This is something she knows, she just doesn't want to believe it. So I don't know why they decided to treat it as like a point of tension or intrigue, because it really isn't. But anyway, still good, a bit sort of messagey, but good. Then a story from the Netherlands by Christian Boomsma, maybe. The Bones in Her Eyes. And in this one, we follow a woman who runs over a cat while driving, and her sense of guilt and sort of obligation to the cat's elderly owner kind of lands her in a very nightmarish situation with no way out. I think it was good as far as the writing and the storytelling goes, although I wasn't really sure that I was fully on board with what it was doing on a conceptual level. Just the story fundamentally feels kind of, I don't know, cynical, mean-spirited. The way that it seems to be saying that, you know, being kind and empathetic is what gets the main character into the supernatural trouble. I don't really like when fiction is cruel just for the sake of it, which I don't know if that's entirely the case here, but that's partly how it read to me. Okay, then a story from Canada, Quebec specifically, Twin Shadows by Ariane Jelinas. This was a very gothic story of two siblings, maybe literally siblings, maybe not, I'm not sure. One of whom is a regular living girl and the other is a ghost, a vampire-ish creature, some kind of other entity that's latched onto this girl, who knows. But she's kind of living as the girl's twin, who can only be seen by this girl. But this was a really good, I think, story of loneliness and a sort of obsessive attachment and jealousy, with some very nice creepy and macabre touches, I think. Again, this one was a bit cruel though, with the way it ends. I won't say how, but I did get a slightly cruel vibe from this one as well. I mean, it is horror, so like, not really something I can complain too much about. Next up, a story from Sweden, Backstairs by Anders Fager. And again, one of the better stories here. The plot is a young woman is being treated by a psychotherapist because she's been having some issues with recurring dreams and some other things that don't really make sense. Is the thing that she's dreaming about just a dream, or is it happening in reality? What's actually going on? And the protagonist, the psychotherapist, gets a bit too deep into this into the case of this patient. It's kind of Lovecraftian, I think it's not a spoiler to say, but the appeal for me was not in the Lovecraftian, monster element, but in the rest of it. I think the way it's told, it's a story that you read for the way it's told, a sort of, these plain, short, fragmented, hypnotic sentences, often, just omitting the subject of the sentence, just, did this, did that. And there's a sort of slow accumulation of detail that works really well with horror, I think. Yeah, a very fun read. Then a story from Finland by Marko Hautala called Pale Toes, which I found, I was going to say Lovecraftian again, but that's not, I don't know, probably more like McKennian. It reminded me of Athermacan and his little people. So in this story you have a sort of prehistoric sort of kind of people, kind of humans living in these undiscovered, unchronicled caves on the border between France and Spain. And thematically the story is concerned with a couple of things. One of them is the large age gap in the protagonist relationship. Older man, younger woman. And the other part is a sort of awakening of primal instincts, I guess, return to the meat and the blood and the bone of being human, and tries to connect those two strands, but I didn't really get what the connection was, what the two things really have to do with each other. That's really all I have to say about this one. Next up, a story from South Africa, Kira, by Martin Stein, in which a man is trying to get himself out of a bad relationship that's going to affect his career, whether he stays or whether he goes, because he's been he's a lecturer working at a university, and he's been having a relationship with a married professor at the same university, and her husband is a dean there as well. So anyway, he's trying to get out of this mess, and he goes back to a childhood home by the lake to spend a weekend there. And while there, he's sort of dangerously tempted by an otherworldly, like woman, lake spirit creature thing, and let's say he makes a very lovable new friend. It's a pretty simple story, but nicely written, kind of, I was going to say lyrical, but that's not the right word, kind of hopeful, definitely one of my favorites in the collection, and I would have liked to read more from this author, but only a couple of things have been translated into English, and I think he mostly writes crime fiction. Then, story from Denmark, a donation by Lars Ahn, in which you have this very comfortable, materially very comfortable, newly engaged couple who are visited by a boy, ostensibly, like supposedly, collecting donations for charity. But then that visit turns into something else entirely. It's fine, it's good. Personally, I don't really care about this sort of story. It's a kind of Twilight Zone-esque, with unlikable people getting punished by ambiguously supernatural, or maybe not, forces. And I think it's even less appealing when it's so wrapped up in this contemporary, over consumerist comfort culture, and the self-congratulating charity, and the sort of deeper apathy kind of underlying all of that. I will say this one also has a home invasion element, so that part worked well for me. The rest of it, I appreciate it, I think it's well written. I did not care as much personally. Then a story from Ecuador, which is one that I don't really have much to say about, but it's Tiny Women by Solange Rodriguez-Pape. It's about a tribe of tiny women who live in a hoarder's house in this jungle of furniture somewhere. This one was one of the more surreal ones. That's all I have to say. Then Another story I really enjoyed from Catalonia by Elisenda Solsona called Mechanisms, and this one was very, very good except for the very end, which I found a bit too bizarre, and then it also ends on a pun, which is a weird choice for me for a story that felt quite, you know, atmospheric and quite atmospheric and serious up to that point. Anyway, so this follows a gay couple. One of the husbands is a photographer pursuing his art, and the other is working some kind of a regular job to support both of them. Although he did also used to have artistic ambitions. He used to want to make a comic, but he has put that aside to focus on, you know, making money for both of them. And you can probably guess there's some tensions between them because of that. And they head to this practically abandoned ski resort, so the photographer can get the last picture he needs for an upcoming exhibition. And this ski resort has a bit of a history where the visitors there kept turning up dead or just disappearing, supposedly because there's a bear in the area, but maybe not. And yeah, obviously it's a story of a troubled marital relationship where one of the husbands wants children, the other is too focused on his art, but then he misses that past version of his husband, the one that also had artistic ambitions, and yeah, it's about that sort of bitterness in the relationship and whether they can find a way to move forward together or whether it's just too late. And it does end without really clarifying that. The final sentence is literally one that you can read both ways. And that ties into what I said about the pun, which is a bit, I don't know. I'm not sure about that ending, but anyway, yeah, really good. I do wish there were more stories about healthy marriages, even in horror, you know, rather than all of this dysfunction. I think I would have preferred a version of the story where, like, the husbands have all the same, you know, tensions and disagreements about art and money and children, but just without, like, letting it poison them so much as human beings. Yeah, something, but this is just like a random aside, but apparently this is originally from a collection of stories, which are all set on the same night in which the moon disappears from the sky, which seems like a cool sort of kind of weird, kind of surreal premise that I would like to read if it ever appeared in English, although the story itself does not really have much to do with that. Anyway, next up, a story from Senegal. I can't pronounce this name, so I have no idea. I'm not even going to try. It's the House of Luc de War, maybe. I honestly have very little memory of the story, and there's nothing in my notes to help me. All I remember vaguely is that I think Luc de War is like a figure from Senegalese folklore, and there was something about gangs, maybe? Obviously I found the story forgettable, which might be just me, but anyway. Next up, a Norwegian writer, Fridtjof Spala. I think that's a Danish way of pronouncing that, but I don't know. Anyway, it's called The White Cormorant. This story is actually set in Ireland, despite the writer being Norwegian. So I don't know, does that count as two countries with one stone. Anyway, in the story we have a young man who works up the courage to try and sail around a particularly dangerous rock. And when his boat, is inevitably crushed, he's saved by another one of these ethereal, otherworldly women, spirits, things. And his encounter with this woman is very short, but something that just changes his life from that point on, something he's not going to be able to forget. And this was one of the more strongly folky, folklory stories in the anthology. I enjoyed it. Then another one that's quite folky, and I don't think this is a translated one, actually. I think this was originally in English. It's All the Birds by Yvette Tan, in which a woman returns to her hometown to nurse a close childhood friend of hers who's now ill. And while they're in the house, birds are beginning to gather around the building. This protagonist has a life back in the city, a boyfriend she's supposedly happy with, but still she goes back to this, superstitious village that she wanted to leave behind, and still she allows herself to become closer with her friend again, who has always wanted to be more than friends. And she returns to this old abandoned life, which is starting to kind of pull at her again, in other ways that's not just her friend's illness. Very good story, very good story. I think Yvette Tan has more collections that she's published, and I do want to look at those. And then the last story was from Spain again. So Spain is definitely... Well, is this the third story from Spain, I think, in the anthology? It's a Jose Maria Latorre's story called Snapshots, in which a man cannot stop taking pictures in a photo booth in a random neighborhood. And every time he takes a picture, he ages significantly. Until there's nothing left of him. I guess that spoils the story, but it's not really the kind of thing you can spoil anyway. You basically know what's going to happen, and you are just watching it unfold. I found it pretty boring, to be honest. It's just, like I said, you can see where it's going, but it just keeps plodding along, dragging things out without any real tension or intrigue, and without really, it never develops into anything more interesting or surprising. And yeah, that was the last story. So despite all of my criticisms, still there's not a single bad story here, I don't think. There was no story that I read and was like that's an actually bad story, badly written or whatever. No, they're all good. I do get the sense that my taste in horror is pretty different from the Valancourt people, from Jenkins and Cagle. They wrote in their editor's notes that they open and close with a banger, and their idea of a banger is really not the same as mine, because it was Oiranda and Snapshots, respectively, which were two of the more boring stories in the anthology for me. But still, like I said, overall had a good time. It's a good anthology, and I will be reading the second volume as well. Now, the second book I want to talk about is one I own a physical copy of, and it is by an author that was featured in the Valancourt World Horror volume, and that's Luigi Musolino. and the book is A Different Darkness and Other Abominations. I've had this copy for years, and even though I didn't really love Oiranda, I still wanted to give Musolino another try, another chance, and see what his other stuff is like. And this was a fairly enjoyable, but still also frustrating collection of stories. Well, first of all, I should say, like, I'm happy to say that Musolino's stuff, like, more generally, is more interesting than Oiranda. But it still has most of the issues of Oiranda as well, in various forms, which I'll come back to. So there are 11 stories here, plus 11 stories for Italy, so Italy wins. And I'm not going to go through each one individually here, like I did for the anthology, because that was, different authors, so I think it made more sense. But here it's a similar sort of vibe throughout. But anyway, this is pulled together from several different collections that Musolino published in the original Italian. And there are, and the stories have slightly different vibes. So broadly speaking, there are two strands here, I guess. There are the stories from Oscure Regioni, Dark Regions, which was one of Musolino's collections based on Italian folklore, where he sort of takes a myth and makes it horrible. So you have something called the Dahu from the Aosta Valley, sort of folklore creature that's longer on one side of the body than on the other, because they live on the mountain, and that means they can only go clockwise or anti-clockwise around the surface of the mountain slope, depending on which way the body is built, which is like a fairly whimsical sort of thing, but not in Musolino's version. And he does similar things with other bits of folklore as well. There's the Stagman of Castelnuovo al Volturno, the Marocca from Arezzo, which is a kind of sewer monster, I think. And the Stagman is, well, a Stagman, a stag god, like a horned god figure, maybe, I'm not sure. I haven't really looked into it too much. Anyway, that's one sort of broad group of stories here. And then the other group is the sort of psychologized trauma horror of his other collections, his more recent collections, I think, which is also where Oiranda would fall into as well. There is some overlap, obviously, but it's still, they feel like generally sort of distinct strands. Now, so the author bio here describes Musolino as a specialist in Italian folklore. So I think it makes sense that the folk horror stories are where he does his best work. They were creepy, and I really enjoyed learning about bits of Italian folklore that I really knew nothing about. Not that the other group, not that the other type of story is bad, not that the whole like trauma as horror aspect is bad. Like on the whole, I think Musolino is a good storyteller in terms of his plot and his characters. All the stories here are good, really. My problem is more like a personal problem with his overall style. So, as I mentioned, when I read Oiranda in the anthology, I thought he was a heavy-handed writer, and that's very much still true for all the stories here. Part part of it is that I don't really see much finesse in his prose, or I don't know, maybe it's James Jenkins' translation. But either way, I kind of found myself rolling my eyes a bit at some of the sentences here, like including some these stock phrases like "darker than the darkest night," "a scream that was 1,000 screams," which really have no place in a well-written horror story. Not if you want your reader to come away from it with any kind of aesthetic feelings or atmosphere. Okay, sorry, I look different. That's because my camera died, so I'm finishing this on my phone. Anyway, as I was going to say before that happened, the other part of the problem for me personally is that Musolino is very explicit about what everything means and what the stakes are. And I think that's the part of the problem that irritated me more. It's not that there's nothing to think about in these stories. Beyond the literal horror, all the stories here tackle some kind of larger problem, whether that's, social, ecological, psychological, political, whatever. Some kind of problem with its own, set of questions. But the problem is, the questions are all pointing outwards, outside the story. What do we do about X? How do people cope with Y? What would I do if Z happened to me? So in that sense, there is a lot to think about. But my issue here is that all of that is outside the story. But inside the story, there's nothing really. It's perfectly clear what everything is and how you are meant to feel about it. And there's no room to dream, really, if that makes sense. Internally, the stories feel more like a sort of lucid argument, I guess, and not any kind of, exploration of their subject matter. You can disagree with them, but you can't really have any doubt about where they stand. And it probably didn't help that I did disagree with them at times, because the vibes here are relentlessly bleak, almost hopeless, in a way that I kind of get in the context of, the current times and whatnot, but I still don't really have that much patience for it. For example, there's a story called Pupils with a very kind of gross antinatalist nihilism to it that I just found exhausting. And a lot of the stories here have this kind of very bleak, very hopeless vibe, which, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not a real criticism, but it's not something I love. So that's kind of where I am with Musolino, I guess. Despite all my misgivings, I feel like this review, if this is a review, was mostly criticism. But despite all my criticisms and misgivings, I still had fun reading most of these stories. And there were a couple that actually dealt with the sort of sublimity, the sublime, and a kind of fascination that is often wrapped up in horror, which is very much my kind of thing. That's an aspect of horror fiction that I really love. So these were stories like A Different Darkness, the titular story, and I don't know how to pronounce this title, but L'Abominations d'Altitudes, maybe. And I feel like yes, in this sort of take on the sublime and the fascination and all of that, they are still as blunt, as direct as they are in everything else. But I've realized, I think, that I can let a lot of things slide when the book I'm reading is pandering to me thematically. So I still enjoyed that. Yeah. Overall, I don't think I'll be, reading another Musolino if another one ever appears in English. Uh, he's just too direct for me personally, but I don't regret reading it at all. And like I said, I had a good time with it. So that was my Horror Mayhem reading project. Lots of stories from Italy. Uh, 12 stories from Italy, a handful from Spain, 3, I think, and then a bunch of stories from a bunch of different places, one from each. And yeah, despite my mixed feelings about some things in these collections, I feel like um, I definitely enjoyed myself overall, and I'm glad I read both of these books. Um, and I'm glad I did this reading project. And I feel pretty confident in recommending both books, really. If you are interested in world horror from different countries, then really the Valancourt anthology is a no-brainer. Uh, they're all good stories, especially if you like the more conventional sort of horror, you'll have a blast with it. For Musolino, you need to have a taste for and a high tolerance for bleakness and just saying things outright that could have been implied instead, but I guess didn't need to be. Like my complaints are mostly questions of personal taste, I think. Uh, so yes, a big yes to the Valancourt anthology. Definitely recommend that one. Uh, for Musolino, A Different Darkness, I do recommend this as well, if you like this kind of thing. Okay, so that was Horror Mayhem. Good experience overall, and maybe I'll do it again next year. We'll see. If you've read any of these books and want to discuss them, I'm very happy to talk about them. There's the comments. There's also my email in the video description. So yeah, get in touch. But for now, that's it. So until next time, maybe, whenever that ends up being.